Welcome back to another book review from the Indie Fantasy Club and Teddy. Today we're going to be discussing The Hunter and the Knight by Brett Lurie in his Endless Frontier series. Now, before I get into the review, I just wanted to give a quick shout out and a quick thank you to Brett for sending me this copy of his book. When I started this channel, I never expected authors to send me their book, and I just honestly created this channel because I love to read fantasy books, and I feel like indie books just don't get as much time to shine. So that was my only purpose in creating this channel. Just want to express my appreciation for that. Now, this book is about 150,000 words, maybe a little bit less, I would estimate, and this is the first book in a planned series of 4. And if you check out some of Brett's social media, he actually explains that he's already in the editing process of book 2, and he started writing for book 3. So that's very encouraging for all of us who have, let's say, Game of Thrones or Name of the Wind trauma. Yeah. So what is this book all about? At its core, I'd say it's a treasure hunt. You've got a disgraced knight who's hired a bounty hunter to help him find an ancient treasure before his old order discovers it. And since Casta Crane is the most skilled bounty hunter in the entire country, for the right price, she agrees to help. And this hunt for this ancient weapon takes them all over the country, from abandoned tombs to underwater towns, and things are going relatively well until the competition decides this little duo is a little bit too much of a threat, and they decide to put an illegal bounty on them. So now, not only do they have to find the treasure, they also have to try and keep their heads while doing it. So with that context in mind, let's dive into this indie review. Let's first talk about the immersion. This was an 8.5 out of 10 for me, and the author really did do a pretty good job with the immersion experience. You definitely get a sense of depth from the history of this lost ancient civilization that kind of is the foundation of all these different cultures. That feeling of like mystery and curiosity as to what those ancient people were really keeps this story really engaging for me. He also gives you a little taste of the different cultures from the various races and people as the main characters travel all around. And this gives it kind of like a nice scope to the entire region that they're covering. Another cool thing is that the characters are able to enhance themselves with cybernetics, which I thought was kind of an interesting addition to the story. So the setting itself is really well done. I feel like he does a good job getting us involved in this world. But because things do move pretty quickly, I would say, as far as the pacing goes, we don't really get to explore a lot of these ancient things as much as I would prefer. They're kind of just popping in and out pretty quickly to these various places. But it does leave me wanting more, so perhaps that was his strategy all along. Guess we'll just have to see when we get to book 2. As for the names, I gave that an 8 out of 10. Now, the reason why I gave it an 8 out of 10 was I really enjoyed the characters. One of my qualms with the characters was just that, like with Costa, for example, I would have liked it if we would have got a little bit more internal thought processes, especially in the beginning, as opposed to like the dialogue that she speaks. The reason why I say that is there's this one scene where they're basically in this trapped tomb, kind of like an Indiana Jones types of a situation, and I just feel like she says things and it takes away from the impact if she had just internalized them, and it would have added some conflict and tension between this knight and this bounty hunter. But with that said, I really do enjoy duo characters. Sherlock and Watson, Kaladin and Syl, Legolas and Gimli. I just really like it when you get contrasting characters that are forced to work together. And Miss Crane is a...
Call me Costa.
Oh, right. My bad. Costa is a treasure hunter and a bounty hunter in a sort of technologically advanced Wild West. So she's definitely pretty rough around the edges. And she's paired up with this kind of pompous religious knight, Sir Dresco.
Pompous? That is terribly rude.
Dude, you wore a full suit of armor the whole time and you were basically useless. As I was saying, the banter and the humor that occurs between these two characters is very fun to read. It does kind of remind me of like Holmes and Watson, but if Watson was the smart one and Holmes was the one kind of, that was his companion, but they kept the same personality traits. So imagine an arrogant Sherlock Holmes that isn't the one solving the mysteries. That's kind of the vibe that I got, and I really liked it. But more than that, Brett does a good job developing these characters as they face these new challenges together. And I think I also would have liked to see just a little bit more depth from the side characters and the antagonists. They did feel a little bit tropey, a little bit surface level, maybe a little bit too shallow, especially when they were compared to, Dresco and Miss Crane.
Just Costa.
Do you mind? I'm trying to do a review here. The Magic I gave a 7.5. Since I would categorize this more as sci-fi than fantasy for most of the book, I'm going to rank the technology as part of this section. Like I mentioned before, you've got cybernetics, you've got communication devices, you've got lightsabers and flying ships. And one thing that I like with this book is that the technology feels soft, in the sense that he's not overly explaining the mechanics of all of these different technologies. He just gives you enough to know how it's working and he just moves on. I appreciate that. I don't want to know the mechanics of the technology. Now, he does start to fold in some fantasy or magical elements about halfway through the book. We start to see talking statues, magic swords, mythical sea creatures. My only gripe is that it's just brushed over so quickly, and I get that they don't really have magic in this time period. They don't really believe in it, so it makes sense why they're moving so quickly over some of these things. But I just, as a fantasy reader, would have liked to spend a little bit more time with the magical elements of the story. Just learning what everything means and what the powers can do. The way that it's written, I'm hoping that we're going to get a lot more of that in the second book, but I guess we'll see. Now, the actual infrastructure of the book was a 9 out of 10. I thought Brett wrote this about as well as any indie author I've seen. The pacing was really good, maybe a little bit slow in the beginning, but nothing egregious, and it's written in third person from Cass's POV, so you do get to experience a lot more of the emotions and the thoughts, throughout the whole story, which I really enjoy. I also felt like the prose was really accessible and easy to read. It flowed really smoothly, which again is something that I prefer. And the rising action that led to the climax just kept me glued to the pages. Like as soon as I crossed that halfway point, I was just really tearing through the story. And the resolution was so heartwarming and satisfying and exciting as you prepare for what's to come next. It does have a good ending. I wouldn't necessarily call it a cliffhanger, but I definitely want to see where this story ends up going. And that brings us to enjoyment, which gets an 8 out of 10. Now, you have to understand, I'm not much of a science fiction reader. I'll be the first to admit that I am too dumb for that genre most of the time. I had to listen to Project Hail Mary as an audiobook because my brain just could not comprehend the words and the concepts of what was going on in that story when I was trying to physically read it. So keep that context in mind. So even with this book, even though the sci-fi elements were relatively simple and easy to grasp, I would say it's just probably not my preference. And since the first half of the book was mostly sci-fi based, it was like a 6.5, 7 reading experience for me as I was getting started, which honestly was kind of what I was expecting. When I saw that this kind of had the technology aspect to it, I was kind of nervous about reading it and giving a review because, again, I don't normally like that type of story. But then we get into the second half of the story and a statue comes to life. Okay. All right. Then we get a telepathic whale. Okay. And then we get a magical freaking sword. Oh yeah. The second half of this book just popped off for me and really started feeling more like a fantasy than a sci-fi. So the second half of the book was like a 9 out of 10 reading experience. So overall, really great and kept me super engaged. It was a pleasant surprise because I honestly didn't know if I would like this type of fantasy. Turns out I do. How fun for me. Also, another quick note that I wanted to mention of something that I liked was the fact that there weren't any humans in the book. They were humanoid, but they had like gills or they had different features about them that made them not strictly human. And that's one of my biggest gripes with fantasy writers is we're supposed to have these grand, expansive worlds, just new experiences, and it always has just humans, elves, and dwarves in them. This is fantasy, people. Let's get a little more creative with these races. So, Brett, giving you points for that one. And that leaves us with an overall score of 8.2 out of 10. I can honestly say I did not expect to enjoy this book as much as I did, especially because I tend to lean more towards the epic or high fantasy stories. So I'm just really glad I got exposed to this. I'm really glad that Brett reached out to me because I just don't know that I would have normally picked up a book like this. So if you're like me and you want to try something new and you want to expand your reading palette, I'd recommend The Hunter in the Night just to give it a try, and I think you'll really like it. All right, should we do a bonus design review? I think so. Now, there's a lot to unpack here. I actually really like covers like this, personally. I think that the fantasy genre went through a pretty long period of minimalism and simplicity when it came to book covers, really focused on typography and maybe a few simple designs, which usually looks pretty clean and professional, but it also tends to blend in with every other fantasy book out there. I think that the dust jacket and the cover itself does a great job of providing a visual for these characters and this world that we're experiencing. Sometimes it's nice to get a little bit of a head start with characters just so that you can have some type of concept or idea of how these people look. So I always appreciate it when the character's on the cover, just so that I can just get right into that story without having to conjure up these images myself in my mind. It does sort of give a little bit of kind of like an AI vibe to it, but it doesn't really bother me that much. It also has some good drawings of the Trugans, which are the cybernetic lizard horses that they're riding around throughout the story. So it's nice to get a visual of those as well. We get a lot of like nice little illustrations throughout the whole book, which I think look really good. The map, I think, is crafted really well. It shows where all the places are. We're able to follow the journey throughout. It covers the whole page. So it's just formatting professional, very clean, very well done. We also get a couple of like these drawing illustrations throughout the pages, which again are nice because they just add some of that visual aspect to a fantasy that just helps you dive into the story a little bit more. And I understand that this is a little bit higher cost for indie authors, so I never expect there to be illustrations, and I'll never hold that against an indie author. But when I do see it, I get excited. I think it's kind of cool to see, you know, the vision of the author kind of come to life on the pages. All right, let's get this added to the shelf. I think that looks nice. If you liked this review, be sure to join the club so you always discover these indie treasures for your TBR. And if you're already subscribed, I love you, and I'll see you in the next video.